Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Safranski, and welcome to the Bible and the Eucharist. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Gospel of John. Now, there is so much in John, way too much to talk about in a short video or a short lifetime. In John especially, the awesomeness of the Eucharist is based around the radical nature of Christ's incarnation, and that is all over John. So, right, when you think about it, the amazing reality of Christ's body becoming food for us is related to the reality of the second person of the Trinity, of God becoming flesh, right? And that's all over John, so we could spend days, years, decades talking about that, but we got to focus. So we're going to talk about our couple of things that are particular to John. I'm going to talk about the bread of life discourse, or John chapter 6, which is very unique to John and is where he puts most of his explicit Eucharistic teaching. And I'm going to talk about the Last Supper in John, which doesn't actually have much supper to it. So let's start with the bread of life discourse. Now, the lead-in or the intro to the bread of life discourse is the feeding of the 5,000. Remember in a previous video when I talked about the multiplications of the loaves and the fishes? I mentioned that it would be in John, and we would talk about it a little bit when we got here. Well, the story in John is roughly the same as the story in the other Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, like the Gospel of Luke, there is only one feeding. There's only one multiplication, right? Which is unlike Matthew when we looked at the two feedings. But there's only one feeding in John. It's 5,000 people that he feeds. It's roughly the same story with the same major elements where Jesus takes, blesses, breaks, and gives, right? So we have that sacred meal structure. And we also have the fragments collected into 12 baskets. If you remember, I mentioned that the 12 baskets represent the tribes of Israel, and the community of John behind John's gospel is very much a Jewish Christian community. So the 12 baskets represent the giving of the Eucharist, especially to the Jewish people. Right now, of course, there's a few things in John's multiplication that are distinctly John. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is always the one taking initiative. He's always the one controlling the narrative and the events. So if you lay John's multiplication of the loaves and fishes against, say, Mark's or Matthew's, Jesus in John is going to sound more in control. He's going to sound more like he's got an exact plan for everything that happens. And that's just kind of the way that John depicts Jesus. John focuses very much on Jesus as the Son of God. And so we see a little bit more of his divine status and his divine knowledge. While the other Gospels, like especially Mark, focuses a little bit more on the humanity of Jesus, so you don't quite get that overwhelming sense of his divine nature and his divine knowledge. So that's kind of what makes the multiplication distinctively John. Now, John also mentions that when the multiplication is happening, that Passover was at hand. He uses this phrase when the multiplication is happening. This gives the multiplication yet another very clear link to the Last Supper and therefore to the Eucharist that is not present in the Synoptic Gospels. So just another little link between the multiplication and the Eucharist that is distinctively John. Now, the whole context around the multiplication is broadly similar. It is leading into and surrounded by stories that indicate Jesus' authority and his status before God, his unique status before God. But what happens after the multiplication in John is very, very unique. Now, if you read John front to back and you pay careful attention to it, one of the things you'll notice is that Jesus often takes what people say, takes questions that they ask, and he'll kind of spin them into unique narratives or unique dialogues that are clearly not exactly in the mind of the person asking the question, right? So he does that in this circumstance. Basically, what happens in John is that after the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes and Jesus walking on the water, the people are kind of hunting him around the Sea of Galilee. They're trying to find him. And the big question kind of hanging over that is, why are they trying to find him? Are they trying to find him because they believe in him and they want to follow him? Or are they trying to find him because he fed them, he gave them bread? And are they trying to find him because he does flashy miracles? Well, let's read just a little bit of that and what's going on in John chapter 6, verses 25 to 27. We read this, quote, "When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, 'Rabbi, when did you come here?' Jesus answered them, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, you seek me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you.'" Unquote. Okay, so as I mentioned, he takes their question and he kind of spins it in a direction that's not exactly what is expected. They ask him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" And on the face of it, what that question means is, when did you come to this spot on the other side of the Sea of Galilee? Because remember, they've been hunting him around the lake, around the sea. But he spins this as if their question was about when he came to earth and where he came from. So the whole bread of life discourse that is going to take up the rest of chapter 6 is really an answer to the question, not the question that they really asked, but the question that he kind of gives them, right? And it's a question about his origins. Where did he come from and when did he get here? So he tells them, and by spinning their question this way, I try to think about it like this. Jesus is basically saying, your questions are too shallow. The ones that you're asking on the surface, the ones that you're asking with your mouths, are not enough. They're not deep enough. You need to hunt. You need to hunt for me in a more authentic way than just looking for me around the shores of the sea. Right? So he accuses them again of just kind of looking for him physically because he gave them physical food in the multiplication. And the whole discourse, the whole bread of life thing starts with him telling them, do not labor for perishable food. Don't just hunt me because you want physical bread. Well, they ask him what sign he is going to give them to prove his authority, as Moses gave manna to their fathers in the desert. Right? So they basically are saying to him, look, you want to claim all this authority that you're claiming, this status that you suggest that you have before God, then you're going to need to do something that is great to prove to us that you actually have this authority, that you actually have this status. And so he basically starts answering this question with a kind of long dialogue sermon on a series of biblical or semi-biblical phrases. And I say semi-biblical because one of the most important passages or quotes that Jesus is going to discuss is not actually a direct biblical quotation. It's more of a paraphrase or a kind of mashup of some things in the Old Testament. So I'll get there in a second. So the whole discourse is way too long and way too complicated to go through every line here. So what I want to do is just comment on a few key points that say something about Jesus teaching on the Eucharist, and especially points that are kind of unique to the Gospel of John. So one of his points that he works off of in verse 31 is he wants to comment on this quote. He gave them bread from heaven to eat, unquote. Now, that is not a direct biblical quotation, but it's a kind of statement of what the Jews believe about Moses. That they understand Moses to have given their fathers in the desert a kind of heavenly bread. Jesus' answer to that is like this. Compared to me, that was hardly bread from heaven, right? His answer is essentially, I, Jesus, am the real bread from heaven. That kind of puts the manna in the desert to shame. Now, before we get into the kind of explicitly Eucharistic stuff, we might ask the question, in teaching these people who have not received the full teaching on the Eucharist yet, why would Jesus associate himself with bread? Why would he start off kind of comparing himself to bread, like the manna in the desert? Well, because bread, for all these people, for the ancient people, is what gives them life. And especially in the story of the manna in the desert, that manna was sent explicitly by God for the purpose of giving life sustenance, right, to their ancestors. So for these people in Jesus' day who begin by looking for normal perishable bread like the manna, Jesus tells them that what God has sent now is even greater. You thought that was heavenly bread? I am heavenly bread. Right? Now we read this in verses 41 to 42. The Jews then murmured at him because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven. They said, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, I have come down from heaven? Unquote. So we see that this is really a discourse about Jesus's origin. Now, these people know that the manna was really sent by God from heaven to earth, right? In a kind of, basically in a direct way. So then they ask, how can Jesus say this about himself since he has human parents? How can he say that he came from heaven in a greater way than the manna came when we know his father and his mother? So he comes back and he answers them, I do have human parents, but I really did come from God in a way that you don't understand. And if you want to live, you will eat my flesh. So again, he's continuing this parallel of himself with the manna in the desert. They wonder how he can claim a divine origin like the manna had. He says that I do claim a divine origin in addition to my human origin. And he doubles down on the comparison between himself and the bread, saying that if you want to live, you will eat my flesh. Just like the people in the desert, okay, not just like, but kind of like how your ancestors in the desert, they were in a wasteland with no physical food. And if they wanted to live, their only choice was to eat the bread that God sent in the form of the manna. Now you are in a kind of spiritual desert. And if you want to live, you're going to have to eat the new food that God has sent, which is my flesh. Okay? Now, of course, this idea of eating flesh, this is different. This is something new. There's no question about that. This is one of the things that makes Jesus' teaching on the Eucharist and his giving of the Eucharist controversial, radical, and in a way new, because the Jews did not have a context for understanding what it would mean to be told to eat human flesh. Jewish people, Jewish religion from the very beginning is absolutely opposed to cannibalism, right? We know that some traditional religions in certain parts of the world, they have cannibalism or the eating of human flesh as part of their ritual life and as part of their understanding of how you relate to God or the gods. Judaism never had anything like that. So when he tells them to eat his flesh, he can't be drawing, he's not drawing on a pre-existing Jewish ritual or a pre-existing Jewish understanding of sacrifice or anything like that. So in verse 52, we read this. The Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Unquote. And Jesus tells them, you must do this, or you will not have life. So, if you ever want to have a discussion with someone, and I would encourage you to have these discussions in a very charitable and friendly and pastorally sensitive way, but if you're ever having a conversation with a Protestant or a Catholic or anyone who doesn't think that Jesus really teaches about eating his flesh in the scriptures, this is one of the best places to go. When Jesus is questioned, he doubles down. He doesn't back up. He doesn't explain, oh, this is just a metaphor. He doesn't try to appease them at all, right? He basically, when they have trouble understanding this teaching, this new teaching, he makes believing it an absolute condition of following him, right? So we read this in verses 66 to 69. Quote, after this, many of his disciples drew back and no longer went about with him. Jesus said to the 12, will you also go away? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God, unquote. Okay? So look, if you give a teaching and that causes many of your disciples to draw back and leave you, and you meant the teaching as a kind of metaphor, wouldn't this be exactly the moment when you would explain that? When you would say, wait, no, come back. I meant it metaphorically, and here's what it means. That is what you would do. And Jesus does not do that. Instead, he turns to the disciples and says, will you also go away? Now, I think Peter's response is one that we need to slow down and pay attention to. Peter does not express to Jesus that he or the other disciples have a full understanding of what he's saying, right? Because full understanding is not a prerequisite for belief. No, what Peter expresses is the assent of faith. What is the assent of faith? Well, we do something like the assent of faith, whether we're religious or not, in every single one of our relationships, but especially in relationships of dependence. Like, let's say when we're growing up as children, we give something like an assent of faith to our parents. What does that mean? It means accepting what is taught or proposed because you trust the person who gives it, right? Peter doesn't say, yes, Lord, the bread will be transubstantiated into your body, and we will receive you in an unbloody manner, and blah, 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 blah. He doesn't say anything like that. He just basically says, Jesus, we know you. We love you. We see that you are the Son of God. So of course we're going to stay with you. We're going to follow you. We're going to believe this. So the reality of the Eucharist is a divisive teaching from the beginning, even in the scriptures. And you know what? Jesus lets them go. So John, I think he's kind of reminding us that as much as we love people and want to help them see the truth, that sometimes they won't be able to see it, or they won't be willing to see it. They won't accept it. And Jesus lets them go rather than backing off of the truth. Why? Is it because he doesn't care about those people? Of course not. He does care about them. But he knows that the only way they can be converted to the truth is if they see and embrace the truth as it is, rather than distorting the truth or watering it down or anything like that. Okay? So if you remember one thing about me talking about the Bread of Life discourse, I hope what you would remember would be Peter's response. Remember, Peter's response is not one of full understanding, but it is one of the assent of faith. All right, so the other big thing I want to talk about in the Gospel of John is the Last Supper quote. And I put that in quotes because there isn't really a supper at the Last Supper in John. This is in John chapter 13. So if you read this carefully, which maybe you've done and maybe you haven't, I don't know, either way, that's fine. I didn't read this carefully, I'm sure, for many, many years of reading the scriptures. You'll notice that John's account of Jesus' last evening with his disciples, there's two unique things about it. One, there's no supper. There's just teaching and a foot washing, right? And two, it's not on the evening of Passover, right? And I remember we discussed this when we discussed the Last Supper in a previous video. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the night before Jesus dies is a Passover evening so that the Last Supper can be a Passover meal. And that's where Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of teach us the most about the Eucharist. John does something a little bit different. In John, Passover is a Saturday, not a Friday, so that Jesus is dying on Friday at 3 p.m. as the Passover lambs are being slaughtered in the temple. Both timelines are profoundly Eucharistic because they profoundly connect Jesus's death to the Passover, and they present Jesus as the ultimate sacrificial animal. And as we've talked about before, you can't be a part of the sacrifice really unless you eat the animal. So the supper part in John is not directly significant. He's already done his main teaching on the Eucharist in the Bread of Life discourse. And this way, by not having the last night with the disciples be a meal or be a Passover meal, he's kind of, in a way, he's kind of skirting, he's not directly contradicting the timeline in the other Gospels because the meal isn't there. So what does this let John do? Why does John do this? Well, I'm not going to pretend to tell you that I know all the answers to that, but I think I can give you a little bit of insight. One thing that this lets John do, because he's already done a lot of his teaching about the reality of the Eucharist in chapter 6. This lets him shift the focus a little bit to a theme of service and the connection between the Eucharist and service. So you all probably already know that foot washing is very, very explicitly about service. In the ancient world, people's feet were not kept clean or protected the way our feet are. You know, a lot more people went barefoot, or at the best were wearing sandals. And so walking around in a dirty, dusty desert climate all day, working with animals, you can just imagine how filthy people's feet got. And so foot washing is something that typically only a slave would do. So by washing the feet of the apostles, Jesus is making a very, very profound statement about service. And he says that, right? He says, if I wash your feet, then how much are you to do that for each other? But I want to talk to you about something that you might not have thought about before, which is the importance of John putting this foot washing kind of in the place of the Last Supper. So this begins with an understanding that all of the Christians in John's day, all of the Christians right after Pentecost, frankly, are living the tradition of the Last Supper. Every Sunday, they are practicing the Last Supper. They are performing the Eucharist. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, which is probably our earliest witness to the Eucharistic tradition, says this, quote, on the night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread, gave thanks to God, broke it, and said, this is my body, which is given up for you, unquote. So when these Christians who are already definitely living in the tradition that the Eucharist happens at the Last Supper, and that we do this on Sundays, when they read or hear the story of the foot washing, what's going to happen in their minds? This foot washing happening on the night before Jesus dies. They're going to associate this act of service and this teaching on service with the Eucharist they are celebrating every Sunday. For us, Catholics now, this is probably, I think this is made most visible and most explicit at the Holy Thursday Mass of the Lord's Supper, when we actually have the washing of the feet performed. At the only time during the year when we do that as part of the liturgy. That is a chance for us to make a more explicit connection between the foot washing, which only happens in John, and the Eucharistic sacrifice. So the question is, if the early Christians did that, how do we associate the Eucharist and service of each other? If we become Christ by receiving him, do we serve others the way he did? Do we take care of the most lowly need of our brothers and sisters, starting with those in our families, those in our church, those in our community? Do we actually become slaves like Jesus did? You know, there's a story told about Mother Teresa that when she had, after she had been leading her congregation for a while so that she had multiple houses, there's a story that when she would go to visit a house, the first thing she would do would be go clean the toilet. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if Mother Teresa came into your house and the first thing she did was clean the toilet? I mean, I get emotional just thinking about it, because she knew what it meant to be a servant to the lowliest and to serve the lowliest and most humble needs, right? So receiving the Eucharist turns us all into a single body, into Christ's body. If we are all made into one single body, how are we taking care of the other parts of the body, right? Feet in Jesus's day are dirty. They're humble. They're low. They're going to be probably a lot more wounded than our feet generally are, because they're just not protected from dangers as much. So for Christ, these feet represent the lowest of the low members of the body. So when we receive the Eucharist, when we think about the Eucharist, I think what John would like us to do is to ask, are we, who are the body of Christ, are we taking care of the needs of the lowliest, the dirtiest, the most humble, and the most wounded parts of the body? We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next video when we talk about our early church depictions of the Eucharist. St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, is going to tell us that if we are mistreating the lowly and the poor in our churches, we are betraying Christ in the Eucharist. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the road to Emmaus and one or two other things as we look at how the earliest of the early Christians saw the Eucharist. Until then, please like this video, please subscribe, please share it, please hit the bell notification, do anything else you can. If you know of anyone who could use this message, show them this video, send them this video. I would love it if you leave comments in the comment section. Most importantly, pray for me and I will be praying for you. Peace.